The city had always been alive with stories. They dripped from the lips of old-timers, whispered in dimly lit alleyways, and echoed through the halls of university libraries. These were the kinds of tales that kept people up at night. Things you couldn't quite explain but felt in your bones. For someone like Fiona, a young reporter for a local news station, these stories were nothing more than fodder for her next piece. Another way to make her name known in the cutthroat world of journalism. But that was before she encountered the most chilling legend of all, the Black Walker. Fiona had never believed in urban legends. She scoffed at the idea that a creature could stalk the city, hidden in plain sight, feeding off the fear of its victims. Her colleagues at the news station shared her skepticism, often making jokes about the supernatural and the macabre as they prepared their evening reports. It was all lighthearted, the way people talk about things they don't truly believe in. But something about this story was different. It had started with an innocuous tip from an anonymous source. Fiona had received a brief, cryptic email that read simply, "The Black Walker is real. Find the truth before it finds you." The email had no signature, no return address, just a link to a series of strange events that had occurred in the city. At first, Fiona thought it was a prank, some bored person trying to mess with her. But as she dug deeper, she realized that these were not random stories. They were meticulously detailed accounts of disappearances, people found in states of severe psychological trauma, all with one common thread. They had all seen the Black Walker. According to the reports, the Black Walker was a figure who appeared only when the thunderstorm clouds gathered, a tall, shadowy figure dressed in tattered clothes that seemed to blend into the night. It wasn't the appearance of the figure that was most frightening. It was the way it made people feel. Those who encountered the Black Walker often reported a sensation of intense dread, like something was watching them from the darkness, even when they were surrounded by crowds. Some claimed to hear soft footsteps following them. Others described the feeling of being touched by cold, invisible hands. Fiona, skeptical as ever, decided to investigate. She made plans to visit the locations mentioned in the reports, each one tied to a local landmark, an abandoned hospital, a forgotten underground train station, and an old library that had long since been closed to the public. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but her instincts told her there was more to these tales than simple superstition. It was just a feeling, one that had gnawed at the back of her mind since the moment she first read the email. Her first stop was the old hospital, a derelict building on the edge of town. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the windows were cracked, letting in the cold, damp breeze. As Fiona stepped inside, her flashlight illuminated peeling paint on the walls, and the sound of her footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. There were no signs of life, only the remnants of what had once been, a place where people had been treated, where stories had been born, and where perhaps something else had been lurking. She didn't know what she expected to find in that dark hospital, but as she moved deeper into the building, a strange sensation washed over her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, as though someone or something was following her. Fiona spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. She dismissed it as her mind playing tricks on her. But then, the sensation came again, closer this time, a breath against her neck. Suddenly the flashlight flickered. The dim light revealed something, a shadow, tall and looming, just at the edge of her vision. Fiona froze. She couldn't breathe. For the first time in her life, she questioned everything she had ever thought about the supernatural. The legend of the Black Walker wasn't just a story anymore. It was real. Fiona stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadow loomed ever closer, its form obscured by the flickering light of her flashlight. The dark figure seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though it was both too tall and too thin for the confines of the abandoned hospital. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination running wild, but every instinct in her body screamed that she was not alone. The air grew colder, and the once faint footsteps now felt as though they were right behind her. Panic surged through Fiona's chest. She spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly, but there was nothing. just the peeling walls and the echo of her own frantic breathing. The oppressive silence settled back in, like a thick fog that made it impossible to think clearly. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, and Fiona's heart hammered in her chest. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. "There's nothing here." But her voice trembled as the words left her lips. She turned back toward the hallway, intending to leave, but that's when she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft that it could have been the wind, but it was unmistakably a voice. The words were barely audible, but they seemed to hang in the air, impossibly close. "Fiona." She froze, her eyes darting around the dark corridor. The whisper had come from behind her. Her heartbeat quickened as she turned slowly, but again there was no one there. No figure, no movement. Only the empty, decaying hospital that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Her hands shook as she gripped the flashlight tighter, but the beam of light only revealed more of the same. A place abandoned by time. Then the temperature dropped further, the chills seeping into her bones. Fiona's breath became visible in the air, a cloud of frost forming around her, as though the very atmosphere was pulling her into some abyss. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet felt heavy, rooted to the spot. It was as though the hospital itself was pulling her deeper into its grasp. Out of the corner of her eye, something moved, a flash of dark cloth, like a shadow flitting across the wall. Fiona's eyes snapped toward the movement, but once again there was nothing there. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the possibility that the Black Walker was not just a myth. Fiona had to leave. She had to get out of there before whatever was lurking in the darkness found her. She turned to run, but as her feet pounded against the cold tile floor, the sound of footsteps followed hers, matching her pace. Every turn she took seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. Her mind raced. This was no longer just a story, no longer something she could control. She was trapped in the very legend she had sought to uncover. She broke into a sprint, heart pounding, the footsteps still echoing in time with her own. And then, just as she thought she might escape, she rounded a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. Tall, shadowed, and impossibly still. The Black Walker. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. The figure did not move, not even a twitch, but somehow she could feel its presence. It was as though it was pulling her in, suffocating her with its stare. She tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but no words would form in her mouth. The cold was overwhelming now, biting through her skin as though it was reaching deep inside her, making her feel as though she might vanish into the shadows herself. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the Black Walker turned and melted into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. Fiona stood frozen, unsure whether to chase after it or to run in the opposite direction, but before she could decide, she felt a heavy presence behind her. The footsteps, closer this time, right behind her. "Fiona." The voice was low and guttural now, more like a growl than a whisper. She didn't think, she just ran. Her heart thudded in her chest as she sprinted through the hospital, her mind a blur of fear and disbelief. She couldn't see the Black Walker, but she could feel it, getting closer and closer with every step. She burst through the hospital doors into the cold night air, gasping for breath, the world spinning around her. Fiona didn't stop until she reached the safety of her car, hands trembling as she locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel. She didn't know what she had just witnessed, but she knew one thing for sure. The Black Walker wasn't just a story, it was real. The following days passed in a haze for Fiona. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow of the Black Walker, standing silently in the hospital hallway, watching her. Every creak of her apartment's floorboards seemed to echo with the footsteps that had pursued her, and the whisper of her name still rang in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted, that something was following her, something that had no business in the daylight world she once knew. Despite the lingering fear, Fiona couldn't let go of the story. There was a part of her, maybe it was the journalist, the driven woman who had always thrived on the thrill of uncovering truth, that refused to be defeated by her own terror. She had to understand what the Black Walker was, what it wanted, and most importantly, why it had chosen her. So, she went back to the library, where she had first found the chilling reports, determined to uncover more answers. The old library was just as oppressive as the hospital. The musty smell of old books mixed with the damp scent of mildew, and the silence hung heavy in the air. It was as if time itself had forgotten this place. Fiona navigated through rows of forgotten volumes, her flashlight scanning the shelves for anything that might explain the Black Walker. She had no idea what she was looking for, just a piece of the puzzle, some clue that could make sense of the darkness she had encountered. As she passed through a narrow aisle, something caught her eye, a worn, leather-bound book, nearly hidden behind a stack of older texts. She pulled it out, brushing dust from the cover. The title was nearly faded, but she could make out the words, "The Shadow in the Streets." With a sense of urgency, Fiona opened the book, flipping through its brittle pages. The pages were filled with descriptions of strange happenings in cities around the world. Unexplained disappearances, people driven mad by something they couldn't understand. And in the margins of the book were drawings of tall, dark figures, eerily similar to the Black Walker. Her hands shook as she read. The book described a phenomenon that had been recorded for centuries, always under different names but sharing the same traits. A shadowy figure that preyed upon those who ventured too far into the dark places of cities. The Black Walker was part of a long-standing legend, a creature that thrived on fear, feeding off the terror it caused. The more afraid a person was, the stronger it became. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. This was no longer just a random story. This was a pattern that spanned centuries, a cycle that repeated itself in the dark corners of every urban landscape. And now, it had found her, but why? What had made her the target? Before she could think further, the library's lights flickered. Fiona looked up, startled. The room was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The temperature in the room had dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch, as though they were alive, reaching toward her. She gripped the book tighter, her pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. The sound of a door creaking open echoed through the library, though there was no one in sight. Fiona's heart raced as she stood up, her eyes scanning the room. Then, from the corner of her vision, she saw it, a figure, tall and obscured by shadow, standing just beyond the stacks of books. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Fiona. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. Her legs felt like lead as she turned to face the Black Walker once again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. The figure had substance, cloaked in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to swallow the light around it. The Black Walker had come for her. Fiona backed away slowly, her mind racing for an escape. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her as the figure took one step forward, then another. Each step was deliberate, as if it was savoring her fear. She had no idea how it had followed her here, or how it had found her, but there was no mistaking the intent in its movements. It was hunting her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned and ran, but the footsteps of the Black Walker followed, louder now, faster. She could hear the unmistakable sound of its feet scraping against the floor, inching closer with each passing second. Fiona burst through the library's exit, her breath ragged and sharp, but when she stepped into the cold night air, she saw nothing. No figure, no shadow, only the echo of her own panic. She didn't stop running until she was back in her car, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel, her mind a blur of confusion and fear. What was happening? How could she escape something that seemed to exist in every dark corner of the world? Fiona didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. She couldn't outrun the Black Walker forever. As she sat there, trying to steady her breath, a sudden thought hit her. Maybe it wasn't about outrunning the Black Walker. Maybe it was about confronting it. She had been running for days, afraid of something she couldn't understand. But perhaps the only way to stop it, if it could even be stopped, was to face it head-on. Fiona couldn't sleep that night. The darkness outside her apartment felt thick, oppressive, as though it was closing in on her. Every small noise, a car passing by, a door creaking, made her flinch. She knew that the Black Walker wasn't just a figure that lurked in the shadows. It was something far more insidious, something that could manifest anywhere. feeding off the fear of those who dared to uncover its existence. And now, it had found her. She was no longer just a reporter. She had become part of the story, the subject of an urban legend that had taken on a life of its own. The idea of confronting it, of finally ending the chase, was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Fiona had spent days running, hiding in plain sight, hoping that if she ignored the problem long enough, it would go away. But the Black Walker wasn't going anywhere. It had come for her, and it would not stop until it had what it wanted. She stood up from her bed, her mind made up. If the Black Walker wanted a confrontation, she would give it one. She would find out what it wanted, how it operated, and how to stop it, even if that meant going into the very heart of the darkness. Fiona gathered her things, her flashlight, her notebook, and the book she had found in the library. The book's pages were filled with cryptic warnings, hints about how to deal with the Black Walker, but there was no clear solution. It was as if the answers were purposely hidden, buried in layers of myth and fear. But there was one thing she could do: return to where it had all started. The hospital. The place where the Black Walker had first made its presence known. The hospital was only a few miles from her apartment, but as Fiona drove, it felt as though the city itself was conspiring against her. The streets were empty, the lights dim and flickering in the stormy night. She could feel her pulse quicken as she neared the old building, and the feeling of being watched, of being followed, returned. But this time she wasn't running. This time, she was ready. The hospital loomed before her like a tomb, its broken windows staring out into the night like hollow eyes. The wind howled through the cracked doors as Fiona stepped out of her car, the distant rumble of thunder mixing with the eerie silence of the place. She walked toward the entrance, each step heavy with anticipation and dread. The Black Walker was here. She knew it. It had never truly left. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, just as it had been before. But now, the feeling was different. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty. She had come here for a reason, and she wasn't leaving until she had answers. Fiona moved through the dark hallways with purpose, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the shadows. Her footsteps echoed, loud in the stillness, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the presence, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "Fiona?" The voice came again, low and drawn out, like a breath on the wind. Her heart skipped a beat. This time, she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew it was there. She moved deeper into the heart of the hospital, past the rooms where patients had once been treated, where lives had been saved and lost. Now they were empty, just shells of their former selves. But there was something else here now, something that had made its home in the darkness. Fiona knew she was getting closer. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she could see a figure standing inside, facing the wall. It was tall and thin, its back turned to her, the same shadowy figure she had seen before, the Black Walker. "You've come," it whispered, its voice a strange mix of sadness and malice. Fiona didn't flinch. "I'm here to end this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. The figure turned slowly, its face still obscured by shadow. But there was something different this time. Fiona could feel the weight of its gaze, not just on her body, but on her soul. It was as if the Black Walker was studying her, weighing her very essence. "You think you can stop me?" it said, its voice cold and hollow. "I am not something you can defeat. I am a part of this city, a part of its shadows, its forgotten corners. You cannot escape what you are meant to face." Fiona swallowed hard. She could feel the grip of fear tightening around her chest, but she pushed it away. "I won't let fear control me anymore." The Black Walker's form shifted, its body distorting like a cloud of smoke. It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its coldness seeping into Fiona's skin. "You will never be free. You are mine now." With a final surge of resolve, Fiona raised the book she had found, holding it tightly in both hands. She didn't know why, but something about the ancient text felt like a lifeline. The Black Walker hesitated, its form flickering as though it were unsure how to respond. Fiona's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't look away. "Fear only has power if you let it control you," she whispered. "You are nothing more than a story, and I am done being afraid." In that moment, The Black Walker's form seemed to shudder, as though it were being pulled apart by invisible hands. Fiona took a step forward, her voice rising with each word. "This ends tonight." With a final chilling scream, the Black Walker dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the cold air and the echo of its haunting voice. The storm outside raged on, but inside the hospital, there was silence. Fiona stood alone, the weight of what had just happened settling in. She didn't know if the Black Walker was truly gone, or if it had simply retreated for now. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. The legend, the creature, it had been a part of her story for far too long. But now, Fiona had reclaimed her own fate. As she stepped out of the hospital and into the rain-soaked night, Fiona knew that some stories were meant to be left behind, and some legends, no matter how real they seemed, were nothing more than shadows. It was a stormy evening in late autumn when Claire Dawson first encountered the legend of the vanishing stranger. She had heard whispers about it in passing, something she had dismissed as nothing more than a tale spun by small-town residents with too much time on their hands. But as the wind howled through the narrow streets of Havenwood, Claire couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to the story than mere folklore. Havenwood, a quiet town nestled in the foothills of a forgotten mountain range, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. The locals took pride in their history, but they also liked to keep the darker parts of it hidden. The town was dotted with old homes, shrouded in ivy and mystery, with long, winding streets that seemed to go on forever. The eerie, constant drizzle of rain had transformed the streets into slick, treacherous pathways, and Claire, a seasoned journalist in her early 30s, had arrived on assignment to write a piece about the town's rich history. But her assignment quickly morphed into something far darker. As Claire sat in the town's only cafe, watching the rain run in rivulets down the windows, she overheard a conversation between two elderly women seated in the corner. Their words were faint, but she could catch bits and pieces. "Don't let her go near that road after dark," one woman whispered. The other nodded, her eyes darting toward the window nervously. "The vanishing stranger. She shouldn't have gone out there. No one who's gone looking for him ever comes back." Intrigued, Claire tried to push her curiosity aside, reminding herself that small towns had a way of romanticizing ghost stories. But as she left the cafe later that evening, the dark, stormy road ahead felt oddly inviting, as though it were calling to her. She glanced at her phone, but the signal had dropped, as it often did in this remote part of the world. For a moment, Claire hesitated, then decided to go for a walk, to clear her head before she called it a night. As she walked further from the town center, the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, and the heavy fog that had begun to settle around her seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the streetlights whole. Claire's footsteps echoed on the damp pavement, the only sound accompanying the occasional gust of wind. It was then that she heard it, a soft rustle, as if something had moved in the shadows. "Hello," Claire called out, her voice more nervous than she had intended. No response, only silence. But then, from the depths of the mist ahead, a figure emerged. A man, tall and shrouded in a long, dark coat. He was walking towards her, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak, but his presence was unsettling, as though he were aware of her every move. Claire's heart began to race as she took an instinctive step back. There was something wrong about him, something otherworldly. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The man drew closer, his footsteps measured and slow, the rhythmic sound of his boots against the wet ground making Claire's skin crawl. As he approached, he raised his head slightly, revealing his face, or rather the lack of one. Where his face should have been, there was nothing but an empty void, a dark hole where features should have been, as if his identity had been erased from existence. Claire's breath caught in her chest, and for a moment she stood frozen, unable to move. The fog seemed to close in around her, and the storm's wind began to howl louder, as though urging her to flee. But before she could take a single step, the man spoke, his voice hollow and distant. "You should not have come here. No one leaves once they see me." A cold chill ran down Claire's spine. She turned to run, but as she did, the world seemed to shift around her. The street that had been familiar just moments before was now unrecognizable, twisting and stretching in unnatural ways, as though the very fabric of reality was bending in response to the man's presence. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just occurred. The man with the empty face, no, not a man, had disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing behind but an overwhelming sense of dread. Her pulse raced as she glanced around. The once familiar road had transformed into something completely alien. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, warped shadows across the street. The storm raged on, but Claire barely registered the sound of the thunder now. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. This had to be a hallucination, a trick of the mind. The stress of the assignment, the isolation, the haunting whispers she'd overheard, it had all started to take its toll. But even as she tried to rationalize it, a part of her knew that something was horribly wrong. Claire turned and started walking briskly down the street, but after just a few steps, she realized the world around her had shifted again. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching far beyond what should have been possible, the mist swallowing the edges of the street. It was as if she had crossed into another realm, one that had no rules or boundaries. The buildings lining the street were distorted, their outlines fuzzy and incomplete, as if they were caught in the middle of some forgotten dream. "What's happening?" Claire whispered to herself, but the words felt insignificant, lost in the oppressive silence. As she hurried forward, she could feel the sensation of eyes watching her, unseen but omnipresent. Every step she took was an act of defiance against the strange reality that had overtaken her. It wasn't long before she noticed something unsettling. The road she had walked down was no longer the same road. The street names were different, the signs unfamiliar. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She was no longer in Havenwood. Desperation set in. She had to find her way back. But even as she tried to retrace her steps, the road seemed to shift further, as though mocking her attempts to regain control. The fog closed in tighter, and the rain began to fall harder, stinging her skin like needles. Claire pulled her jacket tightly around her, her mind racing. She had to keep moving, but every instinct told her to stop, to turn around, to go back. She glanced over her shoulder and for a moment thought she saw a figure in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat as the man appeared again, standing motionless at the edge of the fog. His outline was still indistinct, but his presence was undeniable. The hollow void where his face should have been was just as terrifying as before. Claire froze, paralyzed by a mix of fear and confusion. How had he gotten there so quickly? "Leave," the voice echoed, the same hollow sound she had heard earlier. "You cannot escape. No one escapes." Claire's eyes widened. Her heart raced as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a bad dream. The legend of the vanishing stranger wasn't some folk tale. It was real. The man, or whatever he was, had been waiting for her all along. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and Claire felt as though she were being suffocated by the weight of the darkness around her. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the sound stuck in her throat, smothered by the oppressive silence of the mist. The world felt like it was closing in on her, and the path she had been walking seemed to disappear into nothingness. She turned to run again, but her feet felt as though they were stuck in the ground, as if the very earth was rejecting her. Panic clawed at her chest as she tried to free herself, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The man was drawing closer, his figure slowly materializing from the fog, and Claire knew, deep down, that she had to get away, or she would become another lost soul, a part of the town's twisted history. Claire's legs felt like lead as she struggled to move, the ground beneath her giving way with every step. The world around her continued to warp and distort, bending at impossible angles. Her mind screamed for clarity, but there was no escape. The figure of the vanishing stranger loomed ever closer, his hollow face slowly emerging from the fog, an oppressive presence that made her skin crawl. With every fiber of her being, Claire willed herself to move, to break free from the paralysis that gripped her. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, she felt a surge of adrenaline. Her legs, once stiff and unwilling, propelled her forward with shocking force. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing, but the instinct to survive was overwhelming. She had no idea where she was running, but it didn't matter. She had to get away from him. The rain intensified as Claire ran through the fog, her breath ragged in her chest. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, but one thing was clear. She could no longer trust the road beneath her feet. The town, the people, everything she thought she knew had been swallowed by an otherworldly force. This wasn't a place she recognized anymore. The storm, the mist, the stranger, they were all part of something much larger, something that stretched back into Havenwood's forgotten past. As Claire rounded a corner, she caught sight of a building, tall, dark, and looming. It appeared to be an old, abandoned church. The iron gates that led up to its crumbling steps were rusted and half open, as though inviting her in. The wind howled through the empty streets, and the thunder rolled across the sky, but the church stood still, untouched by the storm. It was a place of refuge, or perhaps a place of reckoning. With nowhere else to go, Claire sprinted toward the church, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the wet stone. As she pushed open the gates, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, thick with a presence she couldn't explain. She stepped inside, the door creaking behind her as it closed with a final, ominous sound. The church was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of distant lightning illuminating the stained glass windows. Her eyes scanned the interior, taking in the weathered pews and the cracked altar. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. There was an unmistakable feeling of decay, of something lost to time, but as Claire took another step, she heard a voice. Soft, barely above a whisper, calling her name. Claire, come closer. It was the voice of a woman, strained and desperate. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she spun around, her eyes searching the shadows, but there was no one there, only silence. Yet the voice came again, louder this time, filled with an unmistakable urgency. Come closer, Claire. You must know the truth. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The voice seemed to be coming from the back of the church, from the depths of the shadows, where the light couldn't reach. She hesitated, fear tugging at her instincts, but something, perhaps the same force that had drawn her to the road, compelled her forward. With each step she took, the voice grew clearer, its tone more desperate. Claire's feet carried her down the narrow aisle, past the dilapidated pews, and toward the altar. As she reached the front of the church, she saw it, an old wooden door, hidden in the shadows, half hidden by a veil of thick cobwebs. The voice was coming from behind that door. Claire's hands trembled as she pushed the door open. The air inside was cold and stale, filled with the scent of dust and rot. It was an underground crypt, dark and foreboding. But in the center of the room, lying in a bed of dried leaves and stone, was an old book, a journal, its pages yellowed with age. Without thinking, Claire approached the journal, her fingers brushing against its surface. As soon as she touched it, a jolt of energy surged through her body, and the voice grew deafening, filling her mind with images of things she couldn't understand. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt as though she were falling into a past she had no memory of. The journal's pages flipped open on their own, and Claire saw a name she recognized. Isabella Dawson. Claire's heart stopped. The name on the journal's pages seemed to pulse before her eyes, as though it were branded into her memory. Isabella Dawson. Her grandmother. The woman Claire had never met. The one whose mysterious disappearance had been a topic of whispered conversations in the Dawson family for years. But Isabella Dawson had vanished long before Claire was born, her name fading into the shadows of family history. Claire had always believed it to be a simple tragedy, an unfortunate accident or a mistake lost to time. But now, as she stared at the journal, she realized that her grandmother's disappearance was far more than just a family mystery. It was part of something much darker, something that connected her to this cursed place. As the pages of the journal continued to flip, Claire's eyes skimmed over faded words and half-formed sentences. Most of it was incoherent, a jumble of broken thoughts and frantic scribbles, but a few phrases stood out. The vanishing stranger. Lost souls of Havenwood. I have seen him in my dreams. Claire's breath hitched as she read further. Her grandmother had written about the very thing Claire had encountered on the street, the vanishing stranger. Isabella had seen him too, decades ago, long before Claire ever set foot in Havenwood. The journal spoke of the stranger's power, his ability to trap people within the town's borders, to twist reality until it became a prison from which there was no escape. But it wasn't just the stranger's presence that terrified Isabella. It was the price one had to pay for trying to break free. According to the journal, the only way to escape the stranger's grip was to uncover the town's secret, its origins, buried deep beneath its foundation. But Isabella had been too afraid, too consumed by the horror of the stranger's existence, to finish her search. And now, it seemed, Claire had picked up where her grandmother had left off. The storm outside had intensified, thunder crashing violently in the distance, rattling the windows. Claire felt the air in the crypt grow colder, the shadows pressing in on her. The journal was urging her to continue, to uncover the truth that Isabella had failed to learn. But what if knowing the truth came with its own cost? Suddenly, the crypt door slammed shut behind her, and Claire whipped around, her breath quickening. The voice of the vanishing stranger echoed in the room, his tone deeper, more sinister than before. "You should not have read it," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "You are not meant to know." Claire's body froze, but her mind surged with determination. The stranger had already taken so much. Her grandmother, her peace of mind, her sense of reality. She wasn't about to let him take her too. With trembling hands, Claire grabbed the journal, flipping to the last page. There, scrawled in her grandmother's frantic handwriting, were the final words. "The price is always paid in blood." Before Claire could process the meaning of the words, a cold, skeletal hand shot out from the darkness, gripping her wrist with terrifying strength. The vanishing stranger was standing before her now, his empty face inches from hers. His hollow eyes bored into her soul, and Claire felt herself being pulled into the darkness. "You are mine now," the stranger whispered, his voice filled with triumph. "You cannot escape." The crypt seemed to close in around her, the walls closing tighter and tighter as though the very earth were swallowing her whole. But just as Claire felt her strength begin to fade, she remembered the journal's last words. The price is always paid in blood, her grandmother's blood. Claire's blood. With an almost instinctual movement, Claire yanked her wrist free from the stranger's grip, pressing the journal tightly to her chest. She felt a surge of energy, an intense, burning heat, flood through her. The room seemed to shake, and the stranger's face twisted in anger. "You are nothing without me," he hissed. But Claire wasn't listening anymore. She ran, her legs propelling her forward with a speed and force she hadn't thought possible. The crypt's walls distorted as she passed through them, and she burst into the night, gasping for air. The storm raged around her, the rain lashing against her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she ran through the fog-covered streets of Havenwood, the mist seemed to lift, the shadows retreating in the wake of her flight. The town, once so alien and unrecognizable, slowly returned to its normal state. The road stretched out ahead of her, familiar and safe. But Claire knew she had not escaped completely. The vanishing stranger would always be with her, lurking in the dark corners of her mind, waiting for her to return. And as the storm finally began to subside, Claire realized that some legends were meant to stay buried, for once the truth had been uncovered, there was no going back. Evelyn Harper wasn't a believer in the supernatural. As a seasoned journalist for a renowned investigative magazine, she prided herself on seeking out the truth, no matter how dark it was. So when her editor sent her to cover the strange happenings in the small town of Glen Hollow, Evelyn thought it would be just another assignment. But there was something different about this case. There was a weight to the air in Glen Hollow that made her skin crawl, as if the town itself was hiding something ancient and deeply unsettling. When she first arrived, the town seemed like any other small, quiet place. The cobblestone streets wound through rows of Victorian houses, their peeling paint a reminder of years long gone. But the people here were different. They were distant, eyes wide with unspoken fear whenever they glanced in her direction. It wasn't long before Evelyn heard the whispers, the stories that had been passed down for generations, tales of creatures lurking in the shadows and forces beyond human comprehension. These were urban legends, things that shouldn't have been taken seriously. But the more she dug, the more she realized these legends weren't just stories. They were warnings. One night, as she sat in a dimly lit diner, an old man named Samuel approached her. His eyes were sunken, and his hands shook as he gripped his coffee cup. "You shouldn't be here, girl," he said in a voice as raspy as the wind that howled outside. "There are things in this town you won't understand. Things better left alone." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "I'm here to uncover the truth, Mr. Samuel. If there's something going on in Glen Hollow, I'll find out what it is." The old man leaned forward, his face tightening with fear. "You won't like what you find. Some stories are better forgotten. Trust me." Despite his warning, Evelyn wasn't one to back down. She had heard rumors about the town, of a secret society that met in the dead of night, of a hidden cemetery where the bodies of the town's founders were buried in unmarked graves. But these were just rumors, right? Nothing more than the wild tales of old people who didn't know any better. As the evening wore on, Evelyn found herself growing more intrigued. She stayed up late, searching through dusty old newspapers in the town library, hoping to find some shred of evidence that could explain the strange stories she had heard. But what she found only deepened the mystery. The more she read, the more it became clear that the legends weren't as fictional as they seemed. There were records of disappearances, strange symbols carved into the town's oldest buildings, and reports of unexplainable events going back over a century. The next morning, Evelyn decided to visit the old cemetery. She had to see it for herself. The fog hung thick in the air as she walked along the worn path that led to the iron gates, the grass beneath her feet damp and cold. The moment she stepped through the gates, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with a sense of oppression, as if the very ground was alive with something dark. The gravestones, some toppled and weathered, looked like they had been untouched for decades. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the cemetery, sending a chill down her spine. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't alone. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the growl reverberated through the cemetery, low and guttural. She quickly spun around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but saw nothing but mist curling around the gravestones. The world seemed unnervingly still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Her mind raced, attempting to reason through the panic, but there was no rational explanation for what she was feeling. A deep, gnawing sense of dread that crawled up her spine like 1,000 unseen fingers. The growl came again, this time louder and closer. But still, Evelyn could see nothing. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but curiosity gnawed at her, pulling her deeper into the darkness of the cemetery. She took a cautious step forward, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. That's when she noticed it, a peculiar marking on one of the gravestones. It was faint at first, just a shadow among the overgrowth. But as she leaned closer, her heart skipped a beat. Carved into the stone was an ancient symbol, twisted, almost serpentine, with sharp lines that seemed to dance in the fading light. The symbol was the same one she had seen in the old newspaper clippings back at the library. It was the mark of the Forgotten Ones, an ancient cult that some believed had once ruled over Glen Hollow. And it wasn't the only one. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she walked along the rows of graves, her eyes scanning the stones. One after another, she found the same symbol etched into the surface. Some were faded with time, while others were so fresh that they almost seemed to glow in the eerie fog. The unease in her gut grew stronger with each step. She had stumbled onto something far darker than she had ever imagined. A noise, like a rustling of leaves, caught her attention. She whirled around, only to be met with nothing but mist. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and her heart hammered in her chest. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, like eyes were peering out from the shadows, unseen but always present. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his footsteps eerily silent on the ground. Evelyn froze, unsure whether to call out or retreat. The man seemed to glide toward her, his presence both unsettling and magnetic. "Looking for something, miss?" His voice was low, with a strange, almost hypnotic quality. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She tried to gather her thoughts, her mind racing with questions. This was the first time she had seen someone in the cemetery since her arrival, and something about this man felt wrong, unnatural even. "I'm just looking around," Evelyn managed, trying to sound casual, though she felt anything but. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, his eyes, if they could be called eyes, piercing through the darkness like black holes. "Does it matter who I am?" he replied with a thin, unsettling smile. "I'm merely the keeper of the stories, the ones people try to forget. But some things are harder to erase than others." Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "The forgotten ones," she whispered, almost to herself. The man's smile widened, and he took another step forward, his voice now a rasping whisper. "They're never truly forgotten, they just wait for the right moment to remind you." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the fog as quietly as he had come. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, the air thick with dread. What had he meant? And who was he, really? She turned back to the gravestones, her mind reeling. The forgotten ones. Was this more than just a legend? Was this cult, if it had ever truly existed, still active in some form today? She had to find out. But as she moved to leave, her eyes caught something in the corner of the cemetery. An old, decaying building that she hadn't noticed before. It was hidden behind a thicket of trees, its windows dark and broken. Something about it called to her, like a pull she couldn't resist. This could be the key to understanding what was happening in Glen Hollow. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she might find inside. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears as she made her way toward the decaying building. The fog thickened with every step, swallowing the ground beneath her feet, until she could hardly see more than a few feet ahead. The air smelled of rot, a stifling scent that made her stomach churn. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, something drove her forward. A sense that the answers to all her questions lay within the crumbling walls of the house. The building, once grand, was now little more than a skeletal structure. The wood was warped, windows shattered, and the doors creaked with a mournful groan when she pushed them open. The inside was just as decrepit. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. As she stepped inside, her flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the rotting walls. The air was thick with silence, but Evelyn could feel it, the pulse of something ancient and dark beating in time with her heart. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed strange symbols painted on the walls, the same marks she had seen on the gravestones in the cemetery. Her breath caught in her throat. This place was linked to the cult, to the forgotten ones. There was no doubt about it now. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive stillness. The further she ventured, the more she felt a presence watching her, lurking just out of sight. The oppressive weight in the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, and her skin prickled with a deep, gnawing fear. Every instinct told her to leave, to run, to escape, but her curiosity anchored her in place. Evelyn's flashlight illuminated an old, weathered staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. With a steadying breath, she began to climb, her mind racing with questions. What had happened here? Who had lived in this house, and why had it been abandoned? And more importantly, what had driven the residents of Glen Hollow to abandon the town's history so completely? The stories of the forgotten ones seemed to hold the key, if only she could unlock their truth. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before her, its end shrouded in shadow. As she moved forward, a sudden noise, like a faint whisper, drifted through the air. Evelyn froze. She had heard it clearly, though the words were indistinct, muffled by the distance. It was a voice, one that seemed to beckon her forward, urging her to follow. She couldn't resist. The whisper grew louder as she approached a door at the end of the hallway. There was no handle, but as her fingers brushed against the doorframe, it swung open of its own accord, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The room was small, almost like a secret chamber, and in the center stood a wooden table, covered in dust and old faded cloth. On the table were objects. artifacts that seemed both ancient and disturbingly modern. But it wasn't the objects that drew her attention. It was the markings on the walls and the strange symbols that were etched into the floor, glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, pressing in on her from all sides. She could make out some of the words now, phrases like, "It's time," and "The circle is complete." Her pulse quickened, her hands trembling as she scanned the room, trying to make sense of the madness that surrounded her. And then, as if the room itself had come alive, the door slammed shut behind her. Evelyn spun around, her heart racing. There, in the center of the room, was a figure. It was a man, though something about him seemed off. His eyes were hollow, empty voids, and his skin was as pale as death. He was dressed in an old, tattered robe, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that seemed to split his face in two. "You've found us," the figure rasped, his voice a low, rasping hiss. "But it's too late now. The circle is closing. There's no escape." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an urban legend. This was real. The Forgotten Ones were real, and she had just walked right into their trap. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the figure. Her mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had uncovered. The Forgotten Ones, the symbols, the whispers. It was all real, and she was now trapped in the heart of their dark ritual. Panic began to claw at her, but she fought it down. This wasn't the time to lose her head. She had to think. She had to find a way out. The figure, the man, moved toward her, his skeletal frame gliding across the room like a predator closing in on its prey. His smile widened, stretching grotesquely as he spoke. "You've uncovered the truth, but there is no escape. The town belongs to them now, to the Forgotten Ones. And you are part of it." Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help her. But the room was empty, save for the strange artifacts on the table, which seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't comprehend. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the walls felt like they were closing in, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her presence. "You can't stop what's already been set into motion," the man continued, his voice now a low, resonant murmur. "The circle has been drawn. You're here because you were meant to be. You wanted the truth. Now, you'll become part of it." With a surge of adrenaline, Evelyn turned and lunged for the door, her hands slamming against it, desperate to escape. But it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. Her mind raced. Was there another way out? What did he mean by the circle? Was she too late to stop it? Suddenly she felt a presence beside her, a cold wind brushing against her face. She spun around, but there was no one there. Yet she could hear faint whispers in the air, like voices calling her name, urging her to surrender. The room seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were alive, drawing its power from the very earth beneath it. The man's voice echoed again, but now it was joined by others, voices, deep and ancient, rising in a chant. "The circle is complete. The ritual is done. You are one of us." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a cult. This was something older, far darker than she had ever imagined. The Forgotten Ones weren't just a legend. They were an ancient force, and their power was tied to the town itself, to its very existence. It wasn't just the people who were cursed. The land itself was a prison, holding them captive for eternity. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet trembled, and a low rumble filled the air, like the earth itself was awakening. The symbols on the floor began to glow brighter, their edges burning with a sickly light. The man, the figure, stepped forward, his eyes glowing now, as if they were no longer human. His voice was no longer a whisper but a roar. "You've crossed the threshold. You belong to us." In a panic, Evelyn backed toward the table, her hands scrambling over the strange artifacts that lay upon it. She had no idea what they were, but they seemed to hum with energy, as if they were calling to her. One item, in particular, caught her eye. A small, intricately carved stone, smooth to the touch and warm against her skin. It was the only thing on the table that seemed different. As she held it in her hand, a vision flashed before her eyes, a vision of Glen Hollow, of the town's history, of the rituals and sacrifices that had kept the Forgotten Ones dormant for generations. She understood now. The stone was a key. It was the anchor that had kept the curse at bay. and now that it was in her hands, she could either break the curse or seal herself and the town into the darkness forever. She didn't know how, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let the Forgotten Ones win. With one final desperate push, Evelyn slammed the stone onto the floor, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. The room shuddered, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then a blinding light filled the space, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled into the air, her body weightless, as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. When the light finally faded, Evelyn found herself standing outside, in the cemetery once again. The fog had lifted, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the gravestones. The town of Glen Hollow looked different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the heavy sense of dread that had once clung to the air was gone. The symbols on the gravestones were no longer glowing, but Evelyn knew the truth. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? She glanced at the gravestones, her heart heavy. The Forgotten Ones had been forced back into the darkness, but the town had paid a price. The legends were true, and now, so was the knowledge of their dark history. Evelyn's journey had ended, but the truth would never be erased. As she turned to leave Glen Hollow behind, the wind carried a faint whisper, almost like a warning. But this time, it wasn't for her. It was for anyone else who might dare to uncover the town's secrets. The Forgotten Ones had been silenced, but they were never truly gone.